January 12th, 1944, 15,000 feet above Halberstadt, Germany. Hauptmann Wilhelm Galand banked his Focke-Wulf 190 hard left, leading his staffel of 9 fighters toward the bomber stream his ground controllers had promised would be vulnerable. The American heavy bombers droned eastward in their standard combat boxes, black exhaust trails streaming behind them like ribbons of certainty. Galand smiled behind his oxygen mask. The escorts would be turning back any moment now. They always did. Then his wingman's voice crackled through his headset, tight with confusion. Single-engine fighters at 2 o'clock high, still with the bombers. Impossible. They were 150 miles inside Germany. The Thunderbolts should have turned back 50 miles ago. The Lightnings perhaps could reach this far on a good day, but these weren't the twin-boomed shapes he'd learned to recognize. These were sleek, predatory, with squared wingtips and a silhouette that sent ice water through his veins. North American P-51 Mustangs. Here, over central Germany. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Galand didn't know in that crystalline moment of recognition was that he was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would consume the Luftwaffe within 6 months. The arrival of long-range Mustang escorts represented more than a tactical inconvenience. It was an existential threat that German pilots would come to hate with a visceral intensity they reserved for no other Allied fighter. Not the rugged Thunderbolt, not the fast Lightning. The Mustang alone would strip away every assumption, every sanctuary, every tactical advantage German fighter pilots had cultivated since 1939. The question wasn't just what made the Mustang dangerous. Every Allied fighter was dangerous. The question was why German pilots singled out the P-51 for special hatred, why veterans who survived the war spoke of Mustangs with a bitterness they never directed at other American escorts, why the appearance of those distinctive silver shapes triggered not just tactical concern, but genuine dread. To understand why the Mustang became the most hated American fighter in German eyes, we must first understand what German pilots thought of its predecessors. By early 1944, Luftwaffe veterans had developed clear opinions about American escort fighters based on months of combat experience. These assessments, preserved in captured pilot interrogations and post-war testimonies, reveal a nuanced picture of respect, disdain, and tactical adaptation. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived in European skies in April 1943. German pilots quickly nicknamed it the Juggernaut for reasons that had nothing to do with respect. The Thunderbolt was massive, weighing over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, the heaviest single-engine fighter in the war. Oberleutnant Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, filed a combat report in June 1943 describing his first encounter. "We attacked a formation of the new American fighters. My wingman scored hits on one from close range, cannon shells that would have destroyed a Spitfire. The American fighter simply absorbed the damage and continued flying. It was like shooting at a locomotive. This was the Thunderbolt's defining characteristic in German eyes. Absurd durability. The P-47's air-cooled Pratt & Whitney radial engine could sustain damage that would destroy liquid-cooled engines instantly. Its massive airframe could absorb punishment from 20mm and even 30mm cannon shells and still bring its pilot home. Hauptmann Heinz Baer, who would end the war with 220 victories, described shooting a Thunderbolt over Brunswick in October 1943. "I hit him repeatedly, saw strikes on the wings and fuselage. Any Spitfire would have been finished. The Thunderbolt simply dove away, trailing smoke, but still under control. We learned quickly that Thunderbolts required sustained fire to kill. But durability came with severe limitations that German pilots learned to exploit. The P-47 was slow to climb, particularly at low and medium altitudes. Its rate of roll was adequate, but unexceptional. Most critically, it bled energy rapidly in tight turns. Major Werner Mölders, one of Germany's first-century aces before his death in 1941, had test-flown a captured Thunderbolt, and his report circulated widely among fighter units. The American fighter is formidable in the dive and when maintaining high speed, but in turning combat, particularly below 20,000 feet, it becomes sluggish. Our fighters can outturn it easily. If engaged at low speed, the Thunderbolt is vulnerable. German tactics adapted accordingly. When Thunderbolts attacked, experienced pilots would brake hard, forcing the heavier American fighters into turning combat where their mass became a liability. Or they would simply perform a split S and dive away, knowing Thunderbolts at low altitude couldn't follow without losing too much energy. The interrogation of 22 captured Luftwaffe pilots in March 1945, preserved in declassified Air Intelligence weekly summaries, revealed consistent opinions about the P-47. The pilots admired its diving speed and ability to absorb damage. They noted it could take punishment that would destroy any German fighter, but they also consistently identified its poor climb rate and tendency to bleed speed in tight turns as exploitable weaknesses. Feldwebel Rudolf Müller, shot down near Magdeburg in February 1944, told his interrogators, "The Thunderbolt was too heavy for some maneuvers. We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast. The P-47 couldn't follow, and we came around and got on its tail. It was predictable. More critically for the strategic situation, the Thunderbolt's range was inadequate. With drop tanks, a P-47 could escort bombers perhaps 375 miles from base, barely scratching German airspace. This meant that American bombers flew the most dangerous portions of their missions deep into Germany, completely alone. German fighter controllers tracked the Thunderbolts carefully, noting when they turned back. Luftwaffe pilots called this the golden moment, when the escorts departed and the bombers became vulnerable. Oberstleutnant Hannes Trautloft, commanding Jag Division 1, described the tactical pattern in his post-war memoir. "We watched the American fighters on radar. We calculated exactly where the Thunderbolts would reach their maximum range and have to turn back. The moment they left, we attacked in force. The bombers knew what was coming. You could see them tighten their formations. But without escorts, they were helpless. German pilots respected the Thunderbolt's durability and firepower, but they didn't fear it. It was a known quantity with exploitable limitations. Engage it in turning combat, force it low where it performs poorly, or simply wait for it to reach maximum range and turn back." The P-47 was dangerous but manageable. It was a fighter German pilots had figured out. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning presented a different set of challenges. With its distinctive twin-boom design and centerline nacelle, the Lightning was unmistakable in the air. German pilots reportedly called it the fork-tailed devil, though post-war research suggests this nickname may have been more American propaganda than authentic German usage. What German pilots actually thought of the P-38 was considerably more complex. The Lightning had real advantages. Its twin Allison engines provided redundancy. If one engine was hit, a skilled pilot could potentially limp home on the other. Its nose-mounted armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and one 20mm cannon, concentrated all firepower in a tight cluster with no convergence issues. And its high-altitude performance was, in theory, excellent. But theory and practice diverged sharply in European conditions. Major Johannes Mackey Steinhoff, commanding a fighter unit in Sicily before transferring to Germany, filed detailed reports on encounters with P-38s in the Mediterranean. He noted that his Messerschmitt Bf 109 could fly faster than the Lightning in level flight, but the P-38 could turn tighter. However, Steinhoff dismissed reports that the Lightning's guns were more powerful than German cannon as exaggerations. The real problems with the P-38 emerged in the brutal conditions over northern Europe. The intense cold at combat altitudes wreaked havoc on the Lightning's Allison engines. Cockpits were bitterly cold. Pilots suffered frostbite on hands and feet so severe they sometimes couldn't operate controls. The freezing temperatures affected engine reliability catastrophically, making the P-38 a maintenance nightmare. Worse, the Lightning suffered from a critical aerodynamic flaw. At high speeds, particularly in dives, the aircraft experienced compressibility. The controls would lock up as airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound. A Lightning caught in a high-speed dive often couldn't pull out, and several American pilots died when their aircraft broke up under the forces involved. German pilots quickly learned this weakness. Unteroffizier Werner Preuss, flying with Jagdgeschwader 54, described the tactic. When a lightning attacked, we would dive away steeply. The Americans often wouldn't follow because they knew their controls might lock up. It gave us an escape route that worked against lightnings but not against other American fighters. The declassified interrogation reports from March 1945 show German pilots had decidedly mixed opinions about the P-38. Younger, less experienced pilots sometimes rated it as dangerous, noting its speed and climb rate, but veteran pilots consistently rated it poorly as a dogfighter. One captured Hauptmann stated bluntly, "The Lightning was easy to shoot down if you caught it in a turning fight. It was large, it was visible, and it was not as maneuverable as our fighters. At low altitude especially, we preferred to encounter Lightnings rather than Spitfires or the later Mustangs." Most tellingly, the P-38's service in Europe was brief. As soon as P-51 Mustangs became available in quantity, the Lightnings were rapidly transferred to other theaters or relegated to reconnaissance roles. By mid-1944, P-38s had largely disappeared from escort duties over Germany. German pilots noticed this transition. When Oberst Gordon Golub briefed his dreams to Gates pilots in July 1944, he noted, "We are seeing fewer of the twin-boom fighters. The Americans have realized, as we did, that the Lightning is not suited for the European theater. Like the Thunderbolt, the Lightning had another critical limitation. It couldn't escort bombers all the way to target and back for the deepest penetration missions. Its range was better than the P-47's, perhaps 450 miles in practice, enough to reach Hanover or Brunswick. But not Berlin, not the synthetic oil plants at Leuna, not the aircraft factories at Leipzig or Regensburg." So by early 1944, German pilots had developed a comfortable understanding of American escort fighters. Thunderbolts were tough but slow climbing and short-ranged. Lightnings had some advantages but suffered mechanical problems in European conditions and could be evaded by diving away. Both types had to turn back well before reaching Germany's industrial heartland, leaving bombers vulnerable during the most critical phase of their missions. Then came the Mustangs. And everything changed. The North American P-51 Mustang's development began not as an American initiative but as a British request. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation requesting additional P-40 fighters. Instead, North American proposed building an entirely new fighter in just 120 days. The result was the NA-73X, which first flew on October 26, 1940. Initially powered by an Allison engine, the early Mustang excelled at low altitude but struggled above 15,000 feet. The transformation came from an unlikely marriage of American and British engineering. In April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew an Allison-engined Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. "The airframe was superb," he reported, "aerodynamically cleaner than even the Spitfire. What it needed was a better engine." Harker proposed fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage supercharged engine that powered the latest Spitfires. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew in October 1942. Maximum speed increased from 390 to 440 miles per hour. Performance above 20,000 feet transformed from marginal to exceptional. The service ceiling jumped from 31,000 to 42,000 feet. But what truly revolutionized the air war wasn't just performance, it was range. The P-51B's exceptional range came from three factors. First, exceptional aerodynamic efficiency from its laminar flow wing, which reduced drag by nearly 30%. Second, internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons in a much lighter, more efficient airframe than the Thunderbolt. Third, the ability to carry external drop tanks without severe performance degradation. With 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B's combat radius extended to 650 miles. With 108-gallon tanks introduced in March 1944, radius stretched to 850 miles, enough to reach Berlin, engage in combat for 20 minutes, and return to England. No other single-engine fighter in the world could match this combination of range and performance. And this is where German hatred began to crystallize. Because range wasn't just a technical specification. Range was sanctuary. Range was survival. Range was the difference between controlling when and where to fight, and being hunted relentlessly over your own territory. The 354th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, received the first P-51Bs in November 1943. Their commander, Colonel Kenneth Martin, had just days to convert his pilots from P-47s to the new fighter. The first P-51B combat mission came on December 1, 1943, a fighter sweep over Belgium and France. But the mission that changed everything came on December 13th, a long-range escort to Kiel, 490 miles from base, previously impossible for Allied fighters. German pilots intercepting what they expected to be unescorted bombers over northern Germany were shocked to encounter aggressive American fighters deep in Reich territory. Radio chatter intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed German controllers repeatedly asking their pilots to confirm fighter types and positions, unable to believe Allied escorts had reached so far into Germany. Major Klaus Mitsch, commanding 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, recognized the strategic implications immediately after landing from a December 30th intercept, where Mustangs had pursued his fighters all the way to their landing approach. He reportedly told his pilots, "The air war has fundamentally changed. Our sanctuary no longer exists." But it was the mission of March 4, 1944, that truly revealed what the Mustang meant for German fighter pilots. 660 American heavy bombers struck Berlin for the first time with full single-engine fighter escort. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, led his 3 squadrons of P-51Bs on the historic 1,100-mile round trip. For Luftwaffe pilots rising to intercept, the sight was incomprehensible. Feldwebel Hans Müller of Jagdgeschwader 11, flying one of the defending Bf-109s, survived the encounter and later described it. "We were in perfect position, just beginning our attack dive on the bombers when tracers flashed past my canopy. I looked up to see single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us from above. It was impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was that these must be captured aircraft, some kind of deception. But then I saw the drop tanks, falling away, dozens of them, and I knew these were real American fighters with range we hadn't imagined possible. What followed wasn't a battle but an execution. The German fighters, caught completely by surprise and out of position, scattered in confusion. In 12 minutes of combat, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. The 4th Fighter Group claimed 15 victories. German attacks on the bombers were broken up before they could press home. That evening, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring initially refused to believe reports when told American single-engine fighters had appeared over Berlin. According to his aide, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, who was present, Göring threw his wineglass against the wall and screamed, "This is treason, sabotage. The pilots are lying to cover their cowardice." But even as Göring raged, the evidence was undeniable. From his own estate at Karinhall, 50 miles north of Berlin, he could see the contrails over the capital. For German fighter pilots, March 4, 1944, represented not just a tactical defeat, but a psychological catastrophe. Every assumption about Reich defense had been based on sanctuary. German airspace beyond escort range was supposed to be safe. Training fields, assembly areas, aircraft factories had been located in central Germany specifically because they were thought unreachable by single-engine fighters. Now, American fighters could reach anywhere. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, commanding 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. We had always known where we were safe, where we could reform, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital. This was the first element of German hatred for the Mustang. It destroyed sanctuary. But hatred requires more than strategic disadvantage. Hatred is personal. And what transformed the Mustang from merely dangerous to genuinely hated was what happened next. Because once the P-51 proved it could reach anywhere in Germany, American commanders unleashed a campaign of relentless aggression that would drive Luftwaffe pilots to the breaking point. In January 1944, General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, issued revolutionary new orders. Fighters were no longer to stay close to the bombers. They were to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. Break formation after bomber drop, dive to the deck, shoot up airfields, catch German fighters landing or taking off, hunt them relentlessly. Captain John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group described the new aggressive tactics. We'd escort the bombers to the target, but once they dropped their bombs, we'd go looking for trouble. We'd dive to the deck, shoot up airfields, catch German fighters landing or taking off. The Mustang's range meant we could hunt for an hour and still have fuel to get home. This was fundamentally different from how Thunderbolts and Lightnings had operated. Those earlier escorts stayed with the bombers because they had to. Every gallon of fuel was precious. They couldn't afford to chase German fighters because they needed every drop to make it home. But Mustang pilots could burn fuel like millionaires. They could chase German fighters for 50 miles, strafe an airfield, and still have comfortable reserves for the flight home. For German pilots, this created a nightmare scenario. Previously, if you survived an encounter with escorts, you could disengage, reform, and land safely. Now, Mustangs followed you down. They circled your airfield. They attacked while you were in the landing pattern, low on fuel, gear and flaps down, completely vulnerable. Oberleutnant Walter Schuck of Jagdgeschwader 7 described the psychological impact. In 1943, we were knights of the air, jousting with bombers in something approaching fair combat. By 1944, we were being pursued relentlessly. Mustangs would follow us down to our airfields, circle overhead while we tried to land, then attack. There was no safety anywhere. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group exemplified this new ruthlessness. On October 7, 1944, he shot down 2 Messerschmitt Me Tu-62 jets by catching them in the landing pattern. The jets, low on fuel and with throttles reduced for landing, were helpless against diving Mustangs. Drew's victory was tactically brilliant, but for German pilots, it represented something darker. A systematic campaign to deny them any respite, any sanctuary, any moment of safety. The second element of Mustang hatred was this relentless pursuit. German pilots described feeling hunted constantly. Every takeoff, every landing, every moment in the air carried the risk that Mustangs would appear from nowhere. Veterans who had flown hundreds of missions spoke of a new kind of fear that hadn't existed before, not fear of death in combat, which was always present, but fear of being stalked, pursued, given no chance to rest or recover. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, wrote in his memoir, "The Mustang didn't just defeat us tactically, it broke something in us psychologically. We went from predators to prey. Every mission, we knew they would be there. Every landing approach, we scanned the sky for those distinctive squared wingtips. We couldn't sleep properly because we knew tomorrow would bring more Mustangs." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But tactical and psychological pressure alone don't fully explain the depth of German hatred for the Mustang. The third element was more visceral. The Mustang was simply better. Not just longer ranged, but superior in nearly every performance category that mattered in combat. The P-51D, which began arriving in June 1944, featured improvements that made it even deadlier. A bubble canopy provided 360-degree visibility, giving Mustang pilots an enormous advantage in spotting threats. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns delivered concentrated firepower. The K-14 computing gun sight automatically calculated lead based on range and rate of turn, dramatically improving accuracy. Most critically, the Mustang could outperform Germany's standard fighters in virtually every regime. Maximum speed of the P-51D was 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 could manage 386 miles per hour at the same altitude. The Focke-Wulf 198 topped out at 408 miles per hour. The Mustang was simply faster. It climbed better. It turned adequately, not as tightly as a 109, but well enough to hold its own. It had excellent high-altitude handling, and most frustratingly for German pilots, it could dictate the terms of combat. If a Mustang pilot didn't like the tactical situation, he could simply use his speed advantage to disengage. German fighters couldn't catch him. They couldn't force him to fight. They could only react to what the Mustang pilot chose to do. Oberstleutnant Günther Roll, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, recognized the qualitative difference. The Mustang didn't just extend the bomber offensive, it transformed it. We could no longer choose when and where to fight. They brought the battle to us on their terms whenever they wished, and their aircraft was simply better than ours in almost every way that mattered. The captured pilot interrogations from March 1945 are brutally honest. German pilots, especially seasoned veterans, rated the P-51 as the best fighter in the American arsenal. They respected its speed, range, and agility. Several admitted they would only try to outrun a Mustang if they had a serious head start. One Luftwaffe major stated, "Against a Thunderbolt, we had tactics that worked. Against a Lightning, we could exploit its weaknesses. Against a Mustang, we had no consistent advantage. It was faster. It could stay with us anywhere. And their pilots by 1944 were well trained and aggressive." This leads to the fourth element of German hatred: pilot quality. Early in the war, Luftwaffe pilots had been superbly trained, with 300 or more flight hours before entering combat. They had developed tactics like the finger four, formation and energy fighting that were revolutionary. German aces like Werner Mulders, Adolf Galand, and Hans-Joachim Marseille were among the finest fighter pilots ever to fly. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 pilots. In February, 2,121. In March, 2,115. These losses included many irreplaceable experts, veteran pilots with years of combat experience. Meanwhile, American training programs were producing 11,000 new pilots monthly. When Mustang pilots arrived in England, they had 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in type and extensive gunnery training. By late 1944, the disparity was catastrophic. New Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with as little as 80 hours total flight time, sometimes less. They were sent to units that had lost most of their experienced instructors. They flew their first missions against American pilots who had 4 or 5 times their flight experience, in aircraft that were superior in nearly every way. Lieutenant Günther Schack, who survived with 3 victories, described his first mission in November 1944. "I flew my first combat mission with 55 hours total flight time. On my third mission, I saw Mustangs for the first time. They were everywhere. I knew then that we had lost not just the war, but the sky itself." The mathematics of this disparity were brutal. In 1943, a new Luftwaffe pilot had perhaps a 50-50 chance of surviving his first 10 missions. By early 1945, the average life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot was 7 missions. Some units experienced 100% turnover in a month. Jagdgeschwader 301 lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945, while claiming only 41 victories. German veterans watched helplessly as undertrained replacements were slaughtered. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who would later survive terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, reflected, "We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely fly formation were expected to engage Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It wasn't combat, it was murder." I stopped looking at the replacement pilots' faces. I knew most would be dead within a week. This created a vicious cycle. Experienced German pilots were killed by better-trained Americans in superior aircraft. Their loss meant fewer instructors for the next generation, which meant even poorer training for replacements, which meant higher loss rates, which meant even fewer experienced pilots survived. The Mustang's combination of range, performance, and well-trained pilots accelerated this death spiral, catastrophically. But perhaps the most hated aspect of the Mustang was its fifth characteristic. It enabled the systematic destruction of everything that sustained the Luftwaffe. Because the P-51's range meant no target in Germany was safe, American planners could execute campaigns that were previously impossible. The most devastating was the oil offensive. Germany had always been dependent on synthetic fuel production, converting coal to aviation gasoline through the Burgess hydrogenation process. This required massive industrial plants that were vulnerable to precision bombing. Before the Mustang, these plants were too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter escort. Without escort, bombers couldn't survive over the target long enough for precision work. The Mustang changed everything. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major attack against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers, escorted by 735 fighters, including 298 P-51s, delivered 1,718 tons of bombs, with unprecedented accuracy. Production at Luna dropped 90% overnight. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen from 175,000 tons per month to 35,000 tons. By September, just 7,000 tons, barely enough to fuel 500 sorties per day across all fronts. Training flights were cancelled entirely. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 50 hours total flight time compared to 250 hours that had been standard in 1942. Feldwebel Hans Hartigs, transferred from the Eastern Front to Reich Defense in July 1944, described the deteriorating situation. By summer 1944, we were limited to one training flight per week, then one per month, then none at all. New pilots arrived at our units having never fired their guns in flight, never practiced formation flying, never engaged in mock combat. They were lambs to the slaughter. The shortage wasn't just fuel. It was experience, confidence, everything that makes a fighter pilot. The Mustang also enabled systematic attacks on aircraft production facilities. The great factories at Regensburg, Augsburg, Wiener Neustadt, and Leipzig, previously beyond escort range, now faced regular precision attacks with full fighter protection. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, testified after the war. The Mustang allowed the Americans to maintain continuous pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a factory, resume production, and within days it would be destroyed again. We began dispersing production to caves and forests, but this increased costs and reduced efficiency by 75%. German fighter production actually peaked in September 1944 at 3,375 aircraft, but losses that month were 3,217. The Luftwaffe was literally losing aircraft faster than the world's most efficient industrial economy could build them. Moreover, the quality of hastily assembled aircraft from dispersed facilities was declining. Engine failures, structural weaknesses, and system malfunctions plagued new aircraft. Oberingenieur Kurt Tank, designer of the Focke-Wulf 190, visited frontline units in December 1944 and was shocked. Aircraft were being delivered with critical defects. Engines that should run for 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces were jamming. Guns were misaligned. We had gone from producing the world's finest fighters to pushing out flying death traps. The workers were exhausted. The materials were substandard, and the testing was non-existent. Transportation networks were shattered. Mustang pilots became adept at train busting, destroying locomotives with their 50 caliber guns. A single Mustang could carry 2 500-pound bombs or 10 5-inch rockets in addition to its guns, making it a formidable ground attack aircraft. By early 1945, German forces could move only at night. Daylight movement meant almost certain attack by marauding Mustangs. The sixth element of hatred was this: the Mustang was everywhere. Unlike the Thunderbolt, which had limited range, or the Lightning, which was withdrawn from European service, the Mustang could hunt anywhere in the Reich. German soldiers in convoys, German workers in factories, German pilots on their own airfields. None were safe from the silver fighters that seemed to fill the sky. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group. On October 12, 1944, he shot down 5 Bf-109s in a single mission. But he also described the moral complexity. We went from protecting bombers to attacking anything that moved. We'd strafe trains, knowing they might be carrying civilians. It was total war, and the Mustang gave us the capability to take that war anywhere in Germany. By 1945, the ruthlessness had intensified. Earlier in the war, there had been a degree of chivalry. Pilots who bailed out were generally not attacked. Damaged aircraft trying to withdraw were sometimes allowed to escape. But by 1945, American pilots had seen too many friends die. They knew the war's end was near, and they wanted to ensure the Luftwaffe could never recover. Lieutenant Hinrich Bartels, with 99 victories, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944, one victory short of becoming a century ace. His wingman reported, 6 Mustangs. They came from above and behind. Hinrich never had a chance. They followed him down, firing, continuously. Even after his aircraft was burning, they kept shooting. They wanted to make sure. German pilot losses tell the story of systematic annihilation. Of the 107 German pilots who had achieved 100 or more victories, 95 were dead, seriously wounded, or captured by war's end. The Mustang hadn't just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had annihilated its institutional memory. Every experienced pilot killed meant fewer instructors for the next generation. Every veteran lost took irreplaceable tactical knowledge with him. Germany's technological response came in the form of revolutionary jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262 and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet. The Me-262, capable of 540 miles per hour, was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of experienced pilots, it could slash through bomber formations and escape before Mustangs could react. Yet even these technological marvels couldn't reverse the tide. Adolf Galand, flying an Me-262 with Jagdverband 44 in 1945, shot down 7 aircraft but recognized the futility. We were like a few tigers facing hundreds of wolves. For every Me-262, the Americans had 50 Mustangs, and Mustangs could loiter over our airfields, attacking jets when they were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The jet engines of 1944 to 45 were temperamental, requiring careful throttle management and long runways. Mustang pilots learned to exploit these weaknesses. They would orbit German jet bases, waiting for the Me-262s to take off or land. During these critical phases, the jets were slow and vulnerable. Lieutenant Urban Drew's technique of catching jets in the landing pattern became standard practice. By early 1945, the arithmetic of air combat had become impossible for Germany. The United States produced 15,486 P-51s during the war, with approximately 8,000 serving in Europe. At peak strength in March 1945, the 8th Air Force alone operated 14 fighter groups, equipped primarily with Mustangs, over 1,000 aircraft. Against this, the Luftwaffe could muster perhaps 300 to 400 serviceable fighters on any given day, scattered across the entire Reich. Fuel shortages meant many never flew. Pilot shortages meant those that did were often manned by teenagers with minimal training. The kill ratios reflected this imbalance. By 1945, Mustang pilots were claiming 10 victories for every loss. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, ended the war with 24 aerial victories, all in Mustangs. He observed, "By 1945, it wasn't combat, it was execution. We'd find German airfields, circle overhead, and shoot down anyone who tried to take off or land. The Mustang had made all of Germany a combat zone. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots provided revealing testimony about the Mustang's impact. Their testimony, collected by Allied intelligence officers and later historians, provides unique insight into why the P-51 generated such visceral hatred. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galand, in his memoir The First and the Last, wrote, "The P-51 Mustang was perhaps the most significant fighter aircraft of World War II. Until it appeared, we had controlled the timing and tempo of air battles over Germany. After it arrived, we never regained the initiative." Major Heinz Knoke, who survived the war with 33 victories, was more blunt. "The Mustang killed the Luftwaffe. Not the bomber offensive, not the invasion, but that fighter that could fly to Poland and back. We went from predators to prey in the span of 3 months. Perhaps most poignant was the testimony of younger pilots who entered combat late in the war. One captured pilot stated, "I flew my first combat mission in November 1944 with 55 hours total flight time. On my third mission, I saw Mustangs for the first time. They were everywhere. I knew then that we had lost not just the war, but the sky itself." The contrast with opinions about other American fighters is striking. German pilots respected the Thunderbolts' durability. They noted the Lightning's concentrated firepower, but they reserved a different kind of emotion for the Mustang. Not respect, not admiration, but genuine hatred born from helplessness. Hauptmann Günther Rohl explained it succinctly in a post-war interview. "The Thunderbolt, we could evade by climbing or turning. The Lightning had mechanical problems and limited numbers. But the Mustang, it was everywhere. It was faster than us. It had more range than we thought possible. Its pilots were well trained, and it hunted us relentlessly. We hated it because we couldn't escape it, couldn't outperform it, couldn't even hide from it in our own country." In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, American and German fighter pilots met at a reunion in San Antonio, Texas. The conversations revealed the lasting impact of the Mustang on both sides. Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in Mustangs and scored 16¼ aerial victories, sat across from Oberst Günther Rohl, Germany's third highest scoring ace. Rohl raised his glass and said, "To the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won the air war, we had excellent aircraft, superb pilots, and were fighting over our homeland. But you had the Mustang, and that made all the difference." Walter Schuck, who had transitioned from Focke-Wulf 190s to Me-262 jets, added, "We went from laughing at unescorted bombers to taking cover from Mustangs in just 4 months. No military force has ever experienced such a complete reversal." Former Luftwaffe General Johannes Steinhoff, his face still bearing scars from his Me-262 crash in April 1945, reflected, "We hated the Mustang because it taught us the danger of underestimating one's enemies. You ask when we knew the war was lost? It was that day in March 1944, when we looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin. At that moment, every German pilot knew the truth. We had already lost." The final statistics of the Mustang's impact are staggering. Total Mustangs produced, 15,486. Enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat in Europe, 4,950. Enemy aircraft destroyed on ground, 4,131. The kill-to-loss ratio in air combat exceeded 11-1, unprecedented in aerial warfare. But the true impact can't be measured in statistics alone. The Mustang broke the Luftwaffe's will to fight. It enabled the invasion of Europe. It shortened the war by months, perhaps years. The transformation from German confidence in October 1943 to complete aerial impotence in April 1945 occurred with stunning rapidity. Why did Germans hate the Mustang more than any other escort? Not because it was marginally better in some technical specifications. The Thunderbolt was more durable. The Lightning had concentrated firepower, but the Mustang combined every advantage into a single package that was psychologically devastating. It had the range to reach anywhere, destroying the concept of sanctuary. It had the performance to outfight German fighters, removing tactical advantages. It had well-trained pilots who could exploit its capabilities fully. It enabled relentless pursuit tactics that gave German pilots no rest. It made possible the systematic destruction of oil production, aircraft factories, and transportation networks. And it was produced in such overwhelming numbers that resistance became futile. German pilots didn't hate the Thunderbolt because they could evade it. They didn't hate the Lightning because it was withdrawn from service. They hated the Mustang because it was inescapable, superior, and represented the complete negation of everything they had built their defensive strategy upon. Feldwebel Rudolf Müller, captured in February 1945, perhaps said it best during his interrogation. The Thunderbolt we respected for its toughness. The Lightning we dismissed as troubled. But the Mustang? The Mustang we hated. We hated it because when we saw those squared wingtips, we knew there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no advantage we could exploit. It was faster than us. It could go anywhere we could go, and it would hunt us until we died or surrendered. That is why we hated it. Not because it was just another enemy fighter, but because it made us helpless in our own sky. The P-51 Mustang didn't just win the air war. It shattered the last illusions of a regime built on lies about superiority and destiny. It proved that free societies could organize, innovate, and project power more effectively than totalitarian states. It demonstrated that technology and industry, properly applied, could overcome any defensive advantage. The German pilots, who looked up in shock at those silver Mustangs in early 1944, were witnessing their own obsolescence. Within 14 months, their entire force would be destroyed, their nation occupied, their ideology discredited. The hatred they felt for the Mustang was the hatred of men who realized too late that every assumption they had held was wrong. Today, preserved P-51 Mustangs still fly at air shows, their distinctive Merlin engines producing a sound that veterans recognize instantly. For American veterans, it's the sound of victory. For German veterans, it's the sound that announced the beginning of the end. For historians, it's the sound that changed warfare forever, the moment when one nation proved it could project decisive air power anywhere on Earth. The story of why Germans hated the Mustang more than any other escort is ultimately a story about the collision between assumption and reality, between propaganda and truth, between what was thought impossible and what American industry made routine. When those Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they didn't just shock the Luftwaffe pilots who saw them, they shocked an entire worldview into extinction. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.